You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, if I'm reading this right, the topic today is tension?
Yeah, there's a bunch of people who are going to join us, and we're going to have a discussion with you.
An intervention.
Yeah.
I love interventions. I've never been to one.
How have you escaped interventions? I can think of so many good interventions that would apply to you.
All right. So what happened recently that made you want to do a whole podcast episode on the subject of tension?
Well, maybe it's just me struggling with things, wondering, like, what's the right thing to do here? And I feel myself getting pulled in one direction and then the other direction, and feeling like I really need to make a decision about this. And then I can't make a decision. How do I resolve these two different tensions? Like, if I go this one direction, it kind of violates the other one. And I've discovered it so many times that it's okay to not try to resolve those tensions, but to try to live with them. And actually, the struggle of living with those competing tensions is really good. If nothing else, it helps a lot of time pass so you don't do stupid things or as stupid a thing. So that's really what got me thinking about. And by tension, I don't mean the kind of tension that you might have in a relationship where it gets uncomfortable and eventually ends in divorce. I'm thinking more of healthy tension, the kind of tension that, that holds up buildings. It's the kind of tension that engineers intentionally put into a plan, like holding up a bridge and so on. And we wouldn't dare resolve that tension. So that's kind of the image I had in my mind.
So this idea that tension is potentially good and bad, but it's mostly good, and there's a tendency among many of us to want to, as you say, resolve tension or make the tension go away. But you're saying a certain amount of that's healthy, right?
Right. We're looking for clarity, and sometimes we define clarity as lack of tension. And in other ways, it might show up even interpersonally. Like, there's this employee who's always seems to be finding fault with your idea and pushes back and never is rah, raising their fist. Yeah, let's do it. They always question. And your immediate tendency is to get rid of the tension, or this decision that you have to make that you go in one direction, it's a very different outcome than the other one. And it's just, I think, one of the things that leaders in particular, and I think most of the people who listen to this podcast are leaders of their firms. And I just thought it was worth talking about anyway. They'll be the judge of that, right?
Oh, it totally is worth talking about it. I love this topic. Here's an example in my world. So when my clients hire business development people, if we get into conversations about how they pay them, I want to pay business development people full salary.
Mm-hmm.
But I want a business development person who wants to be paid a highly leveraged compensation plan, who has a high degree of confidence in their ability, and they don't want to cap on what they earn. I want somebody who's pushing to get paid based on performance.
Right.
But I don't want to pay them based on performance. I'd rather take the bulk of the risk and pay them full salary. So that tension is rarely resolved in a firm. The compensation of a business development person is rarely resolved in healthy compensation agreements.
Right.
So healthy relationships, or agreements in this case, are not the tension-free ones.
And we somehow think that we'd like to remove that tension. We'd like to arrive at a very clear decision that everybody is happy with. And what I'm trying to say here, and I think your examples and my examples are hopefully going to demonstrate that we need to live with that tension, which means acknowledging it, talking through it, and not necessarily trying to resolve it, being open to, more information, being wrong, just being humble about it, trying to learn. So yeah, that's a very good example. And I think anybody that's had a new business person, that resonates with them for sure.
I feel like I've already learned something profound, and we can just stop the podcast.
Should we just end it? Yeah. Let people get back to their miserable lives.
Okay, let's go into some examples. Say we've listed a couple already, but you've probably got a whole bunch more. Where else are you seeing this sort of tension?
The first example came up in a client call earlier this week, and I was talking about how we have to have this balance between confidence and openness to learn. when you're working with a client, they don't want to work with you if you're constantly second guessing yourself. They expect a certain level of confidence that you believe that you are right based on your prior experience, your research, whatever it is. But if you take that too far, then something else happens, which they don't like either. And that's not being open to new information, to being wrong about something. So what is that balance we have to strike? We don't dare go one direction entirely or the other. It's more from everything I know to this point, this is what I think is true. It could be that your situation is a little bit different than anything I've seen before, and I want to be open to that. But I also don't want to throw out all of the things that I've learned that seem to be pointing to this conclusion. That's sort of the spirit that I'm trying to illustrate here about living with that tension. I need to be confident if I expect my clients to pay me well, but I also need to be open to being wrong, not about everything, but about some things where I haven't dug quite as deep in those areas.
We're really walking the line here, right? And I see this too. You think of how we at Win Without Pitching teach people to behave in the sale. You're in this, we call it the polite battle for control. You're jockeying for the power position to be seen as the expert practitioner. But some people with a certain personality makeup, like mine, can easily err on that side and constantly push too hard, and to the point where now you're just annoying your client or prospective client. So there's this balance between, putting your expertise and your opinions forward, but not just constantly badgering the other person, whether it's a client or a team member.
Yeah, because ultimately this advice that we're giving in whatever context, it's delivered from one human to the next, right? And they want you to hold this tension of knowing pretty certainly what you know, but being open to learning. So yeah, this one, I think all of these examples have kind of happened this week. Maybe that would make me think about this topic.
Well, let's keep debriefing about your week. What else happened, David?
Well, the second example of holding things in tension would be trying everything you can to keep an employee that you really value. They've probably been there a few years for you to value them this highly. They get how you work. They fit the culture. They've taken over something that you used to do, and you're really grateful that you don't have to mess with that anymore. But because they're good, they get these offers, and you're not sure how you should just keep responding by paying them more, giving them different titles, maybe giving them a small percentage of the firm, whatever it is. So this tension that you're trying to hold all the time is having people around you that you really hate to lose, but not doing something that mortgages your future by paying them too much and being willing to sort of start over. Your goal is really not necessarily to find employees that are so good that you never lose. Your goal is to build a system that brings good people along so that you have fresh blood all the time, because those new ideas come in and they're helpful, and you simply can't afford to keep everybody for a really long time. So living with that tension all the time, that's something that came up this week as well. I really don't want to lose her. This was a client. I really don't want to lose her, but maybe I just need to, right? It's that tension that I think everybody feels to some degree.
The example of how to reply in this situation would be to, as you say, not resolve the tension and say to that person, listen, that's a great offer. I can't match it. So if I've got to lose you, then I've got to lose you. And maybe there are other reasons why that person will stay. But if that type of tension is something that you feel you always have to resolve, that'll get very expensive, won't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back to the fact that we need to try to not resolve this. So just having a conversation with them exactly like you modeled is the right thing to do. And then just letting things fall where they were. This is part of my whole theory around decision making, is use the right process to make a decision, and then don't worry too much about the actual decision itself. And that's a good example. You just have an honest conversation. I'd love to keep you. You know that. I simply can't afford to pay you. If you need to leave, let's make this a great departure. Let's stay friends. Maybe we'll work together again in the future.
Yeah, Annie Duke, who wrote a great book called Thinking in Bets, and she's got a brand new book out right now. I forget what it's called, but it's on decision making. She would call that resulting. What I mean by that is if you're judging the success of your decision by the outcome,
Mm-hmm.
that's a mistake. That's resulting. It's making the decision based on the results. You have the framework for making a decision. And in her case, it would just be probability. You have the framework for making the decision. You make the decision, and then you let the chips fall where they may, and you don't lose sleep over the outcomes.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, what else happened this week?
What else happened? Well, thinking about how do you balance the two competing needs of running a business that consistently delivers profit without eroding your cash cushion so that, employees aren't worried about whether they're going to get a paycheck, that sort of thing. But every once in a while, an opportunity comes along and you feel like one or two of these, you need to do it, even when it violates your principles of running a safe firm. Whether that's hiring somebody who is a once-in-a-lifetime hire, you're not even looking to add this service offering to the roster, but you've known this person for a while and something has changed on their end and all of a sudden they're available. Or maybe it's doing something that a client has never asked you to do, but it's going to require a lot of your mental attention and some money, and you're going to have to put off some of your new business efforts for it. It's taking your chips and sort of pushing them forward and putting a bet on something. And we're not trying to resolve this tension. We're trying to live with it. We're trying to make good decisions, but we're not too worried about making the right decision. We have to live with the tension of running a sustainable business, but also, in your words, creating future value with the risks that we take now. And it's a risk. I mean, we call it a risk. That means if it goes bad, somebody's going to get hurt. It's going to cost some money or something, right? So that's what I mean in this example.
I don't know if anybody else is getting anything out of this episode, but each of these examples I'm finding to be deeply profound. This one, any business owner has experienced this tension between profit taking versus reinvesting in the business. That is just a constant tension, and it's just something business owners are always faced with.
Yeah, and I hear business owners tell me frequently when I ask them how much money they're making and they like how much they're taking out regularly, and they'll tell me the number. And if it's not a very high number, they'll almost always say, I'm reinvesting in the business, which in some cases is absolutely true. But in other cases, it's simply the way that they put a Band-Aid over the fact that the business is not generating enough profit regularly. So this is real. Yeah, anybody that runs a business and makes these kind of decisions, this is really real. I hope we don't have people listening who are saying, I wonder what he's talking about. Like, what is this putting the chips forward and making a big bet? Because those kinds of folks may not be looking carefully enough at what's happening in the world around them and being open to changing their business in a big way. When you're innovating, what you're doing is what most everybody else, the majority of everybody else, thinks is stupid. That's what innovation is, right? And so talk about balancing risk here.
There's no tension there when you don't have the ability to build up cash, but you start to feel it when you've got a sizable amount of cash in the bank and you think, oh, I could just take this, right? We could just take this as distributions, or no, let's invest in the future. It's rarely all of one and none of the other. It's usually some combination of that. Mm-hmm. But that tension, I find, is very, very real. The temptation to take it all, take all your rewards now, and potentially take on this risk of harming your future, or invest everything in the future and sacrifice in the present. And that's something that never leaves you as a business owner.
And don't you see business owners sort of heading in one direction in the earlier days of their business? That's investing, risk-taking, and then as they tire of the business, they start to take more out and they do less investing in the future. They do less risk-taking. You've talked about that in a previous episode.
I think whatever side you tend towards, it tends to get calcified. So if you're not comfortable operating between both ends of the spectrum, going back and forth, you'll get comfortable with the pattern of just always taking profit or always pushing that profit forward, taking risks in trying to reinvent or innovate the firm.
Yeah.
Like you say, it's not, don't try to resolve this tension, try to live in it, and living in it, living with it probably means in this case sliding back and forth from time to time. Don't just get locked into one very distinct viewpoint on what you should be doing on this front.
Right. Yep.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
What else have you got on the list?
Well, the other one I've thought a lot about, I don't know why it's hit me recently, maybe because I haven't been traveling, but I've always joked with people that you ought to think about axing a service offering or drastically raising how you charge for something when you're on an airplane flying home and you're tired and you may be impatient and you've just worked with a client that was tough. And since I'm not on an airplane anymore, I don't have that advantage. But I was just thinking about pricing. This is your area, so this is just me, not as an advisor on pricing, but just as somebody who thinks about it for myself and for my clients. The goal is not correct pricing all the time. There's this sliding scale where there are times when you feel like, well, I just don't really want to experiment too much right now. The team needs the work. I'm going to do that. And in other times, it's like, shoot, I am so tired of some of these clients and the value I consistently deliver is just not being captured in how I normally price this work. So I'm just going to lay it out there. And if I don't get it, fine. You throw your arms up at certain points. And if we follow this theme, we're not trying to resolve that tension. We're acknowledging that both of those poles are yanking us apart like a medieval torture machine. And it's good to be aware of both of those, and it's okay to dabble in both of them sometime. It's honest to say, I feel this way sometimes, other times I feel this way, and living with that tension because it helps us think clearly. That's what I mean on this example.
This, to me, is another profound point because it speaks to what I see as the most common mistake in pricing among our audience, and that is the idea that there is one right way to price, that it's either retainers or it's value or it's some sort of performance pay or it's something else, where we're going in search of what is the right way to price. And what you've just articulated is something that I think is more appropriate, which is that pricing is a bespoke creative act in a customized services firm of any kind. And you should, from time to time, depending on the financial health of your firm, depending on the client that's in front of you, depending on the opportunity you see to add value to the client, depending on whether you see them as a worthy partner in terms of putting compensation at risk, depending on all of these variables, you should be looking for the right pricing strategy in that moment rather than trying to resolve it universally by going to just one pricing approach.
So trying to understand the principles of pricing, not necessarily land on one particular approach that can be used every time, which is kind of the lazy way to do it, right? It's our seeking for efficiency. And what you're talking about is, no, it's more nuanced than that. Yeah, I love that.
Great. What else is on the list?
Well, the other one is around decisions that need to, at a minimum, be socialized and maybe to some extent they need to be democratized, though I'm a little nervous about that. There are times when you're making an important decision as a leader where you really ought to do what most of your people think. And you need to assume that they don't have it wrong, that there is wisdom in crowds, that they have a better perspective. It's a little bit more balanced. It comes from different directions. If that was what we were aiming for, then all we need to do is take a vote before any big decision, right? But The other extreme is that there are times when you need to make a decision that the majority, maybe even almost everybody, disagrees with, but you have a slightly different perspective on it, either because you've been talking to different people, you have a different aptitude for risk, maybe it's your money on the table, maybe you feel like there's someone in the crowd, which is your employee base, carrying some undue influence over people. So it's not as if we're aiming to have a very clear way to make leadership decisions that impact the team. It's more that we need to be willing to live in a world where there are times when you should listen very carefully and do what everybody's telling you, and there are times when you should not. And it would be the wrong approach to end up near either one of those guardrails. It's more bouncing back and forth between them and wrecking both sides of your car.
I'm at a loss for words. This is another, you're just hitting me in the gut. That's not the right metaphor, but each one of these is landing quite profoundly with me. As you're describing this, I'm thinking of lots of examples in my life and my business where it's like there are times when, just defer to the team. Mm-hmm. They're all saying the same thing. And then there are other times when the team, everybody's wrong and I'm right and this is my decision and they'll follow me, but I've got to make the decision. I was also thinking about when I published my first book, which is over 10 years ago now. I sent one of the close to final drafts out to a bunch of friends for feedback, including you. Mm-hmm. And I got some common feedback from 2 or 3 different people about a change that they suggested I make to the book. You didn't make this suggestion. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, there's like 3 of these people have said effectively the same thing. And I had to think on it. And then I decided they're wrong. I'm going to publish it the way I want to publish it. To this day, I kind of forget what the specifics are. I have a vague idea of it. And I'm so glad I overrode the feedback when there was a clear pattern of a few people saying, no, I think you should make this change.
And people you respected. You wouldn't have sent them the draft if you didn't respect their opinion. Yeah. When you did the manifesto, I remember you asking me, I don't remember specifically what you're talking about here, but I do remember you talking about how to promote this thing. And this is a small thing, but it just illustrates the point. You said, I think I'm going to let everybody read it for free, then put it on my website and let them read it for free. And I'm thinking, what kind of fool? Meanwhile, that book is sold probably 7 or 8 times the number of the book that I published about the same time. So
it's not available for free anymore, but it was for about 4 or 5 years. Yeah, it was going against the grain. Okay, have you got another example of things that happened to you last week that created tension with David?
Well, the last one is something we've talked about in other contexts, but it's worth mentioning here. And it's thinking about the different approach that you would take compared to the approach that all the people who work for you would take. So you listening to this as a principal of a creative or digital or marketing or advertising, whatever firm, you're obviously entrepreneurial. But the people who are working for you are not normally as entrepreneurial as you. We used to be able to say accurately that they just weren't entrepreneurial at all, and that's just not true anymore. Some of the people working for you are quite entrepreneurial. Some of them are going to leave. They're going to start their own businesses. Some of them are going to want to push you for ownership, and they're willing to borrow $1 million and buy it from you. But generally, the people working for you are not as entrepreneurial as you. You thrive, as the entrepreneur, you thrive in lack of structure. And the people who are working for you in your firm, on your team, they want more structure than you think. So those are the 2 extremes. You're trying to pull them to a place where there's less structure because you feel like that yields a more entrepreneurial environment. They are trying to pull you towards more structure because if you don't do that, they're just going to leave. We're not trying to resolve that tension. We're trying to understand both extremes and live within it, charting a course that isn't always right down the middle, but pulls both parties in the opposite direction in the right way. And we're open to seeing our natural tendencies and learning from the other party and charting. And together, the entrepreneurs and the non-entrepreneurs build a beautiful business together.
My face hurts from grinning so much. Tell the audience why I'm grinning, David.
Well, yeah, this kind of goes to the the EOS framework, doesn't it? Where you have the visionary and the integrator and how we tame. I've often thought of the EOS system, which a lot of listeners are using in some form or another. I've often thought of it as the system that allows normal people to work at firms with an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Dan Sullivan, founder of Strategic Coach, one of his many books is titled, I think it's called The Entrepreneurial Organization or Working in an Entrepreneurial Organization. And we've given it to new team members. So it's like, here, you think you're coming into this highly organized place? Read this.
Yeah. Read it and weep. Be seated while you read it. Yeah.
It's just accept the fact that in a small entrepreneurial driven organization, yes, there are frameworks for certain things, but there's also a lot of thinking on your feet. And there's a lot of like just taking responsibility for things and other things like that. I love it. I love his way of thinking. But that EOS system, as you point out, really balances those two different sides. And I'm grinning because, you know, my wife, who's my business partner and who does not listen to this podcast, she's often saying to me, I'm not an entrepreneur. Like, quit torturing me with your behavior and your decisions. I am not cut out for this.
Yeah.
There is a healthy amount of tension between these two business owners that is rarely resolved. You would be happy to know.
Yeah, and that's really the whole point of this, is just understanding your own tendencies, where you might fall on a particular decision-making spectrum, and not trying to resolve these two tensions. We're not seeking the right decision. We're seeking the right process to make decisions. And we're not worried too much about whether the decision itself is exactly right. We're worried about whether we have tried to resolve these tensions. That's what leads us to the best decisions.
Do you have any advice for what process in Canada people should employ for decision making? I mean, you said earlier you've got some sort of theory of decision making, and that theory, I think you said, was basically focus on the process and let the outcomes fall where they may.
Our youngest son is really into board games. He's written a couple of iOS apps that support that industry. I would love to create a board game with him that helps with decision making. So you have certain colored cards that say, okay, I'll never violate these three things, my ethics, my, whatever those things are. And every once in a while I can play a high risk card, but here are the implications of that. It's really a matter of writing down for yourself, even if nobody else ever sees it, how is it that you make decisions and how do you try to balance these things? And as with all things in life, I think you can probably solve it by forcing yourself to articulate how you think. What are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals? How do you balance those sorts of things? And really, I don't have any great system here. I just want people to be willing to live with that tension and not try to resolve it, but try to understand it and use it to their advantage.
I've mentioned before that Ben Thompson of Stratechery fame has this idea of a principle stack. We all have these principles, like we as individuals and organizations, and some of us even kind of proudly articulate those principles. And as soon as you articulate a principle, then somebody's going to call you on it and say, well, you violated that principle when you said or did X. And Thompson's point is that this idea of a stack where principles take priority. So your highest priority principle might be do no harm. And then you would have other principles that fall under that, because whenever you have multiple principles, you'll often find yourself in a situation where you're placed in a position of tension between two or more of those principles. And how do you decide? So if I take your advice and I apply it to Thompson's idea, it would be have this principle stack and then go down the stack. My first principle is this, my next principle is that. Okay, this third one is in violation with or tension with the second one. The second one wins, therefore the decision is X.
Yeah. Shane Parrish of Farnham Street has some good courses on decision making as well, which I think really speak to this. I've been through one of them and I thought it was really useful.
Well, I'm 54 years old, and this is the first time I've really kind of thought deeply about this. Since I was a young man, I've had this idea that inside every person, there's two people striving to get out, and all of the decisions are made in the tension between those two people. Hadn't thought about that one in a while. But the examples that you listed, like I said a couple times already, they just really hit home with me. This might come as a surprise to some listener. It's probably in my nature to want to ease tension, particularly among team members. But there's a whole body of research on selling that's articulated in the book, The Challenger Sale, that says, a challenger is the person who is comfortable increasing tension in the sale, and they are far more likely to succeed than a relationship builder who's driven to ease tension in the sale. So we see that play out in these other domains too. It's got to be universal.
That's fascinating. I'm glad you brought up that example because that really does resonate. This is one of those times when I wish we were in a group of people where we could all just have a great conversation together. But unfortunately, it's just you and I. Hopefully people are taking these thoughts and taking them back to their team and talking about them and thinking about how they make decisions too.
Well, we didn't plan this, but I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to roll out an opportunity for others to participate in these conversations right after listening to the live recording of Two Bobs. So stay tuned for that. There's your little teaser. David, thanks for this. This has been a really, really good one. I feel like I should send you some money, but I'm not going to.
Yeah. Thank you, Blair.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.